Our speaker today is Heather Williams. Heather is a consultant medical physicist and group leader for nuclear medicine at the Christie in Manchester. She's also Director of ScienceGrrl, a grassroots volunteer collective, which is building and strengthening a network of people passionate about passing their love of STEM to the next generation. She was recently awarded an MBE in the 2021 New Year's Honours for services to diversity and inclusion in science. And so Heather's talk today is entitled, "Is Pursuing a Passion for Science a Position of Privilege?" Heather.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Just share my slides. So hopefully everyone can see that. Someone please wave at me if you can't. So it's a real privilege to be here. When I was invited to a Standing on the Shoulders of Giants lecture series, honestly, I don't think I've been paid a bigger compliment in a very long time. So it's a real honour to share with you my understanding of this particular corner of science and the impact it has on all of our practice, whether we're in the hospital or university or industry. So yes, I'm currently based at the Christie Hospital in Manchester. I lead the nuclear medicine group there, which covers our work on the Christie site and our regional and national responsibilities. I also lecture at the University of Manchester and the University of Cumbria on imaging related courses, and a director of the ScienceGrrl network. And when I look at that list and the doctor and the MBE, I often have the question for myself, well, how did I get here? And it's a fairly short story, and I think it's quite helpful as a preamble to the discussion that we're going to be having today. So bear with me while I step back in time. So I was one of these kids who was kind of into everything. I didn't have a favourite subject at school, particularly until I got well into my secondary school education. I like music, I like animals, I like reading. I still play the cello, still like to get out and about in my kayak when the weather's a bit nicer. And for me, it was more a case of, well, pick one. I could have done several things for a living, but I really did enjoy finding out how the world worked, and that science gave me an opportunity to do that. And it was in coming home from a physics lesson at school and chatting to my mum about radioactivity and how some radiation can get out of the body and we can see where it goes using medical imaging equipment, that led me to take up a work experience placement in medical physics at the age of 16. And I always say this when I give this presentation, I'm quite possibly one of the few people I've ever met who knew what they wanted to do when they were 16. So when I'm giving careers talks, I always say, I'm the weirdo. No one else knows what they want to do at 16. Don't worry about it, work it out as you go. But I did at that point think that I wanted to, apply the physics that I loved in a medical context to help people, and decided to become a medical physicist and made all of my, A-level degree work experience choices based on that from there onwards. So I did maths, physics and chemistry at the local sixth form college and went on to do a physics degree at Nottingham Uni. That's not a selfie. I'm so old that that's the day before we had mobile phones with cameras in them. So that's all of us crammed in a photo booth. You usually use for passport photos and someone reaching the button to actually take a picture. And I graduated, yes, in '98, that long ago. There's my mum and dad looking exceptionally proud and me looking exceptionally young. And it's on my CV, first class honours. I don't tell people it was by 0.3%, because I missed an exam in my first year that I had to resit an exam for my first year. And in my second year, I got the time of an exam wrong and basically turned up halfway through. So I had to resit that as well. But despite that, got through and secured a place on the NHS training scheme, which involved a very applied master's course at Manchester University. And yeah, a really rapid upward trajectory in my academic performance there. You can see I've gone from 70.3% to 70.8%. It's just rocketing at this stage. So I decided at this point that I should do a PhD while I had the chance. And part of the influence on that decision was that I met someone I thought would be a good supervisor and would offer a good, interesting project during my training in Manchester. And we worked on the scanners shown on the right. That just shows, again, how long ago that was, and the state of the monitor on the PC I was writing my thesis on as well. And so this was the key finding of my PhD, 3 years of hard work doing novel cancer imaging. And it still remains my most high impact publication. So does iododeoxyuridine measure cell proliferation in non-small cell lung cancer? Initial investigations with PET imaging, the images here with the dark patches showing where there's more PET radioisotope, and radiometabolite analysis, which is the right-hand panel where I went and learned some wet chemistry very quickly in order to analyze what was actually making up this signal circulating around the body. And the short answer to that question is no. So this tracer that I've been trying to use to look at cell growth in lesions broke down pretty much as soon as it hit the liver. And therefore what I'm seeing is perfusion signal rather than anything that's specific to proliferation. But I've done it now, so no one else has to spend 3 years trying to make this work because it just isn't going to. So I got to wear the silly hat of cleverness. I was one of the last few people to graduate from the university. UMIS Dias, as it was, Department of in Instrumentation and Analytical Science, that's it, at UMIS. And so they had this beautiful tan and navy combination. So I thought I wasn't going to pass up the opportunity for that. And so that was in this, actually finished my PhD thesis in 2004 and graduated the following summer and took up a place at Manchester Royal Infirmary as a physicist from there onwards. So I was there for 13 years, gaining more experience in general nuclear medicine before moving to the Christie. And in that time, I had these 2 lovely lads who now look a bit more like this. And moved to the Christie in January 2018 and have moved up to consultant and group leader from then. And this is a small selection of my colleagues at the Christie with our older PET scanner. We do have a much newer and shinier one since that picture was taken. As I mentioned, I do continue to lecture at postgraduate level as well. So reflecting on that career trajectory, there are obviously people who've encouraged me professionally to take leaps into new posts and particularly to go for promotions over the last few years. But what started me on the way to going, I love physics, I want to do it for a living. And that really began, I think, around that point of sort of 16 of coming home and going, I've learned something cool about radioactivity, and my mum going, your dad knows someone who works with radioactive stuff, maybe you should find out if you can do work experience with him. So, and that was not in any way a weird conversation with my parents. The fact that I wanted to do physics, not odd at all. I do vividly remember some of my mum's friends going, oh, aren't you brave? Going and studying physics at university, that I was this great pioneer into this unknown, uncharted land. But for me, it was completely normal because my parents were like, yeah, why not? And I think that really underpins why I felt comfortable making that choice as a woman and also as someone from a fairly working class background. I mean, I wouldn't say I was working class now. Certainly planted well and truly in the more of the middle class unless someone asked me, whether I'm any good at skiing or that sort of thing. But definitely from that background, from the school I went to, from being a woman amongst lots of men in physics, they were like, yeah, just go for it. It's fine. You've got this. And just to put that attitude in contrast with, what quite a lot of girls would receive when they expressed an interest in physics. This is some data published from in Engineering and Technology in 2015. So 93% of parents wouldn't support their daughter in pursuing engineering because they don't think it'll be an environment where they're going to thrive. And I think this feeds directly into the observation, into sort of wider societal messages that girls are getting about what is a good fit for them in terms of where they belong. So in terms of physics, maths or computer science, this is from the Girl Guides Attitudes Survey in 2019. So it doesn't really appeal. We could feel like we would judge, would be scared. Society makes us think that these are not really for us. And we don't have as much perhaps belief in our abilities, despite the fact that girls and boys perform equally as well at GCSE. In fact, there's some evidence that girls consistently outperform boys at GCSE level. And yet, half of all Britain's co-educational state schools don't have a single girl studying physics at A level. So if you have a look at my physics class here, make out that these are my two girls are in my class as well. I had no clue that that was unusual at that point. And that, at sixth form college, I was not the only girl in physics class. So yes, this isn't based on ability. Girls do equally well in the science GCSEs, but the imbalance that's introduced at A level tends to persist all the way through physics qualifications. And it's a similar picture in sort of computer science, engineering, those kind of very physical scientist-based type degrees. And there's a compounding factor that obviously that physics is also predominantly a very white subject area. The data from the IOP is that only 1.7% of all physics undergrads are Black women. So to touch on some of the work that ScienceGrrl's done in this particular area, I actually was quite staggered that it's long ago as 2014, so sort of in the middle of all those references I quoted on the previous slide, that we published our Through Both Eyes report, which we sent a copy of this to every single MP in Parliament at the time. And this was designed to look at the evidence around what is it that makes girls choose a career in science or not, because research in this area has been ongoing for quite some years now, decades indeed. But the most helpful figure, I think, from this report is this very simple diagram. And the three main factors are, as I've picked up on them from my own experience, is it for people like me? Can I see the pathways and possibilities for someone like me in this area, and do I feel confident pursuing those? And there are many sort of voices that speak to each of these questions. So we've got wider societal messaging about what things girls are meant to like and what things boys are meant to like. We've got messages from the classroom. If stereotypes around science are perpetuated in the classroom, then this just builds on what's happening in wider society. And again, the influence of home really can't be underestimated. If your family doesn't know anyone who's a scientist or only knows men that work in science and tech, then the inherent assumption is that that's more likely to be something that is suitable for boys. And there's also, once you've actually made that decision, how these same questions are provoked in the workplace. And I'll come on to that in a little bit in a few more slides time. So here we are 8 years later, and so well, what's changed from that position? And if the news from the last couple of weeks is anything to go by, far too little. The comments that were made by the UK government's Social Mobility Commission chair were brought to my attention by Jess Wade, who, if you don't know her, she does fantastic work on all aspects of equality in physics particularly, but also STEM more broadly, saying that physics isn't something that girls tend to fancy. They don't want to do it. They don't like it. There's a lot of hard maths they don't want to do. And this was picked up in several reports, including this one in The Guardian, with several sort of eminent physicists commenting on this particular turn of phrase. And Jess went on to write an excellent editorial for Physics World, which I really do recommend as a sort of dissection of this point of view. And she said, while her decision to present, sorry, excuse me. present Parliament with uninformed guesses as opposed to evidence-based insight surprised me. Her tired rhetoric is nothing new. Her baseless opinions on physics are equal parts absurd and dangerous. So part of me goes, yeah, right, that's just so ridiculous. But the fact that, 8 years later, from being in a position where we already knew the evidence base was saying quite the reverse, to have this opinion presented as evidence to Parliament, I think is really quite dangerous, that it's placed on a par with genuine expertise in that context. Now, fortunately, genuine experts did enter the room about 10 days later and present a series of pieces of evidence to Parliament, addressing some of the points that have been raised in those comments. And again, the overarching headline that BBC News went with was that girls see physics as for white men only. So we're still with this stereotype of this isn't a place for me because I don't fit. And certainly the perpetuation of those gender stereotypes within schools is particularly difficult. The comments presented in that session of evidence to Parliament was that girls are put off by a lack of in-depth learning and specialist teachers. So actually, if we invest in the quality of science teaching, then that's really going to support all learners. The societal stereotypes I've touched on, and the discomfort of being a minority. The people making decisions about where to place themselves in society. We may well be talking about 13, 15, 14-year-olds at this point, but they know how uncomfortable it is to be to stand out, to potentially make yourself open to ridicule and harassment. And also, if you're going to make that sort of slightly countercultural choice, is it worth it? What's it going to lead to? Where are you going to be able to get with this skill set? And the motivation to sort of push, I had that, I'm going for medical physics, this is what I want. If you have that, then you can push through the discomfort to get to what you want. I was also really provoked by this article by Karen and Jess in the recent the International Journal of Science Education, which looked at parental attitudes. And again, I just really want to emphasize how absolutely key that is, because if you are supported at home, you can deal with a lot of the external pressures and views of the choices that you're making a lot more robustly. But even they said that parents who were most supportive tended to enjoy physics themselves, consider it useful for getting a job. Again, we're back to the awareness of careers again. Judge their child as academics. So again, there's still this stereotype that physics is for the mega bright. Believe me, I'm absolute case in point that it's not. And have the strongest associations with their strongest associations with their child's future participation in physics. So that all engenders a really positive view of physics. And also variables are that the parent had attended school outside of the UK. That's really interesting. That hints at more positive attitudes towards STEM elsewhere in the world. The child being a boy, again, that pulls on the data we saw about engineering, and also parents judging daughters as courageous or determined. I've yet to raise with my parents whether this was a contributing factor, but I think in part it was, because I'm quite stubborn. When I want to do something, I want to do it. And I think they could see that I would find it perhaps easier to push through than someone who didn't have that attitude to challenge and found things quite a bit more intimidating, a bit more difficult. If I'd perhaps been someone who wasn't perceived as courageous or determined, then would they have been more cautious about encouraging me? I think that's a conversation for a cup of tea next time I visit. But once you're into to science, as a woman, what happens? It's not that all of that bias disappears, as I indicated with the impact of the workplace in the previous diagram. And these are two sort of quite famous plots. The one on the left is from a paper by Most-Rakusin, which I'm sure some of you are aware of. And this is this is the absolute one to have in your back pocket when everyone goes, yeah, but we're scientists, we're objective. We're not subject to gender bias. We make decisions based purely on data in an objective way. And this is a group who were appointing a lab manager and have been presented with 2 CVs that were absolutely identical, and one had a male name and one had a female name. And this appointment panel was sort of split in 2, and so with one half looking at the male, one half putting at the female. And the one who looked at the male job descriptions scored the male applicant as higher on competence, higher ability and mentoring ability, and proposed a much higher starting salary. And their qualifications on paper are absolutely identical. So there's, even in the communities that are hiring scientists, there is this baked in gender bias. Across academia also, we can see that there is a deficit between men and women in terms of how much they publish over time. And these plots are particularly, I think, interesting because it also shows that it takes women longer to reach the assistant professor level in academia, which is, I would expect, related to their publication rate. But interestingly, these gaps are closing over time as support for working mothers in particular improves. I think in general, certainly fathers of my generation are adopting a much more engaged and co-parenting model, so that men tend to take part-time working patterns as well as women. But I think that's a fairly new development. It was very unusual, for example, in my dad's generation to do that. And so the support for having both parents in the workplace, the childcare out of hours to facilitate that, has enabled women to join as well as men and be supported through the years when their children are particularly young. And that, if you look at plots from the 1980s, this gap is closing. So that's a bit of good news. But we do still see that there is a bit of a gap. Perhaps that's bias in the way that papers are interpreted and valued from male authors compared to women. But it is improving over time with support for parents, and part of the gap that's related to that time invested in young families is beginning to close. But there are other barriers. So this is a brilliant paper from Lorenz and colleagues from Neuron. And it basically looks at a series of obstacles and gives a whole toolkit of suggestions for what can be done to improve the situation. So where bias is introduced in terms of how grant applications are perceived, how peer review is done, how citation works, and I'll come on to that at the very end, how you're considered for tenure, how we can basically unpick the inherent bias that comes from that white male stereotype scientist in our heads, is all in that paper. It's a great resource. But all of these things, when I'm talking about that, is it possible for you to pursue a career in your passion in science? Is it a privilege? Well, your privilege in terms of avoiding all of these biases and fitting that stereotype does certainly make it easier. I wouldn't say it was inherently a position of privilege, but if you don't have all of these factors stacked against you, it's a lot easier to progress through that kind of system and the parallel systems outside of academia. So that's from Lorenz in Neuron. I think a lot of us have also been very aware that the biases in society have been amplified over the last couple of years under the conditions of the COVID pandemic. And I was really interested to hear of some work that has been done by qualitative researchers at the University of Manchester, looking at the experience of working mums in lockdown. And there have been a number of publications looking at the potential damage to women's careers, as the highest percentage I've seen is that there are 11% less women working now than there were pre-pandemic, because it hasn't been possible to juggle family and work, and it's the work that's gone so that family can be supported through this really testing time. And they look specifically at mothers with children under the age of 16 who'd not been furloughed, and because they're connected with people very quickly at the start of the first lockdown, it's mainly through people that they knew. So we're having, again, looking at those networks of people. You tend to network with people who are very like you. So white British, about 40 years old, 2 kids in a heterosexual marriage was the sort of average of this particular group. And the themes that came out, I think we remember very vividly the corona coaster of trying to just sort of work out how the heck life works this week. The tensions of looking after family, of looking after trying to look after extended relatives, the lack of flexibility in workload, trying to organise family things when you've got very limited options for doing so, and just being exhausted with so much change and so much pressure. And the authors do acknowledge that this isn't a representative sample, and the women actually interviewed recognised that they were really quite privileged. They typically had another adult at home to help. They had their own home, they had outdoor space, they were able to work from home, unlike a lot of women throughout lockdown. So, but I think this kind of little window into the world of women who are working and parenting through lockdown sort of is a good sort of way of looking at the background to plots like this. So this is from Viglione in Nature from 2020, and it's a growing body of work looking at the gender differences in terms of how well women have done compared to their male counterparts in terms of submitting preprints, being first authors on papers, starting new projects, and getting papers completed. So the data, because of the pressures of what's happening at home, primarily falling on mum's shoulders, who was probably doing quite a lot of the household organisation. That's well documented as a general trend still in UK households. That became sort of exacerbated to the nth degree during the pandemic. And obviously, if you've got that additional domestic burden, the opportunities to perform professionally are also diminished. So the effect on publications we see in the bottom right hand corner has now been expanded beyond medicine to look at the variation across different fields, but the overall trend is still that women have published less during the COVID-19 pandemic than men, and we think that's largely due to the wider societal pressures of caring for family and extended family through that period. And of course, I've talked very much about the UK, and I'm aware we've got an international audience today. I would really advise people to also have a look at the wider context in terms of the gender gap. And certainly, even in the UK, the situation elsewhere in Western Europe is different and varies very much across the world. And I think this kind of data actually is, for me, the final nail in the coffin of the suggestion that women are inherently bad at science, because if we're inherently bad at science, we'd be inherently bad at science everywhere, and we wouldn't see such variation in participation in STEM depending on very heavily on the cultural context. So I've spoken mainly to gender differences, and also simply because of the way the literature is currently framed in terms of men and women, rather than a more diverse mix of categories in that discussion. And the reason why I focus on this area particularly personally is it's one that I feel I have the authority to speak to, not only from looking at the literature, but from personal experience. But I don't want to diminish the fact that gender is by no means the only arena in which we come across obstacles and challenges in terms of progressing within STEM. So again, going back to another parliamentary inquiry in July 2021, looking at into equity in the STEM workforce itself. This graph is presented in the summary of that inquiry, which is available online. It's a really useful sort of where we're up to in terms of the STEM workforce, and you can see that whilst we've got a distinct underrepresentation of women in STEM overall, we're also underrepresenting disabled people within STEM careers, and there's also a bit of an offset in terms of ethnic diversity within the STEM workforce as well, compared to the rest of the population. So the key findings of this report were that the STEM workforce is just generally less diverse than the wider workforce, but we don't have data on everything, and I'll come on to that in a minute. And there's a need for the government to basically take a multi-pronged approach to address all these different types of bias that appears to be presenting in this data, and how those biases join together in this intersectional way. So I've talked about how you would feel as a sort of, for example, a woman in a predominantly male context, how that would affect your perception in those spaces by your colleagues, by wider society, by your family, how you would be perceived as differing from that sort of stereotypical scientist. And all of these other factors play into that same route. You don't maybe a man in that context, but because maybe you're disabled, maybe from a different ethnic background, then you're not what's expected in that context. And it all kind of stems from that not fitting with the stereotype, and not basically being the default scientist in those spaces. So there was a submission from the wonderfully named Tigers, the inclusion group for equity in research in STEM. So they've got medicine as well as maths in there, and we're looking specifically at UKRI data, and they commented on the gaps that there are in that data as well. So the availability of how different factors overlay. So the fact that I come from working class roots occasionally is a problem. I was state educated, that's occasionally a problem, and that amplifies the fact that I already stand out as a woman in physics. Other disparities which are not well documented, for example, are the barriers faced by LGBTQ plus people, and because we just don't have good data on that in particular. There's nothing really in the UKRO data, and there's not a lot on socio-economic background as well. So I would really commend the wonderful people in Tiger in STEM to you. And in terms of looking at the literature behind all of these barriers, in the same way as I've spoken about the challenges facing women in STEM, their website is essentially a treasure trove of resource to look at the evidence behind how bias against various groups within science does affect career progression and opportunities within STEM, and even the thought that yes, this is a space where I could fit in and where I could belong. And again, we go back to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and I think if we look at anyone who is already facing some kind of disadvantage prior to the pandemic, that's just been sort of dialed up to 11, possibly 15 in the last 2 years. And I was really struck. I found a thread describing this presentation from Ed Young, who's a journalist in the States, to Yale University's Global Health Justice Partnership earlier this year. And these 2 slides in particular really struck me. The epidemics flowed downward into society's cracks. So where people are already in a position where they basically can't get themselves out of harm's way, in the same way as someone who was, talking about the socioeconomic point in particular, you can't go and hide in your house in the country and have everyone bring stuff to you. You have to go to work on the bus and work in a shop, clean the offices, be on a COVID-19 ward in a hospital. But medical solutions rise upwards into its penthouses. So those who already have privilege are in a better position to access solutions. So they can travel to vaccination clinics, they can work from home, they can again have this, they can also potentially in sort of fee-paying health systems have access to superior healthcare. The point made by the New York Health Commissioner was that our inequality makes me vulnerable. So if we go back to that socioeconomic point again, if you're the person in your house in the country relying on the delivery driver bringing your food to you, you've got cleaners, you've got staff, you've got gardeners, any of those could become ill because they're not as privileged as you and they're at higher risk. So they then expose you to risk. So it's not possible in a pandemic situation to completely isolate ourselves. We need to think about public health for the whole population and not just what is going to work for us personally. So there's been, I appreciate quite a lot of bad news in those slides, and I really don't want to finish with that today. Certainly, I didn't promise to in the blurb, so that's one thing. But the other point is that I think that there are signs of change, and there are signs where we are also, holding steady. And the general reaction to those comments about physics not being for girls in the mainstream press were generally, that's ridiculous. And I think that's actually a bit of a change from what maybe we would have seen sort of 30, 40 years ago, when it'd be like, of course girls don't like physics. But that would be a more common view. So we are getting there very slowly. But where do we go from here? Where do we build on where we are? Where do we continue to sort of hold on to the good and push forward? A model that I found really helpful when thinking about this, and it was shared by Ben Britton, who's a scientist I follow on Twitter. It's actually a video about it that he shared, and I thought actually that's really, really helpful, was the coin model of privilege. So quite often when you talk about privilege, people can get very defensive because it sounds like you're setting yourself above somebody if you are identified as privileged. In the colloquial sense, it sort of sounds like you're a bit stuck up and looking down on people. And of course, no one wants that leveled at them. And people who are privileged in some ways are not necessarily privileged in others. But I think if we imagine sort of structural inequality in society, things like ableism, racism, sexism, heteronormativity, as this structure of inequality, and it's there whether we like it or not. It's been there all our lives. We were born into a culture that was structured to give some people advantage and some people not, because our preconception about what success looks like is still very, very narrowly defined. So whether you like it or not, you are born with a set of characteristics that will put you either in the privileged position relative to that system inequality, or a not privileged, even outright oppressed position compared to that system of equality. So taking me, for example, yes, you know, because of being a woman, I do sometimes face sexism and bias because of that. But I'm white, so I'm fairly middle class, so I avoid a lot of the discrimination and bias that's associated with that. So it's not just you're privileged or you're not kind of clear-cut line. And the paper sort of portrays this as a diagram. So you don't have any choice over where you're placed on this diagram. It just kind of, that's where you are. And I think understanding your perspective on the world around you, because that's where you are in the society and how it's structured, really does help. And just accepting that, yes, there are things that I see a certain way because I am white, because I've always lived in Britain, because I've had the education I've had, because I've been parented in the way I have been. That's where I am on this diagram. But the question is, what do you do about that? It's not just oh, well, that's the way it is. It's what do you do about it? And I think that begins with recognizing where you sit on that diagram. The one problem I've got with this diagram is that it's got a top and a bottom. And I think that does tend to breed this kind of privileged looking down kind of mindset, and that, you know, the people on the above the system of equality, they're above it, and there's the poor people below. I don't think that's actually a very constructive mindset, but I do think sometimes we have even a benevolent interpretation of that, where you want to help and you want to help people who are clearly facing disadvantage, and there becomes almost like this sort of savior mentality. We see it a lot around charity campaigns in particular, that, you know, the privileged person has to wade in and sort everything out. Whereas I think actually the way forward is to keep working on the conversations between the people who have been born into one position compared to another, because they have two different perspectives on the same problem. So if the person who was born with the advantage has got their eyes open and can see the way that life is a little bit easier for them because they're in that position of privilege, then they're also in a position to go, well, what's your viewpoint? What do you see? Because basically, at the end of the day, what we want to do is to pull that coin out of the way. It doesn't exist anymore. But we need to attack. But we need to partner with each other in attacking it. And I think the way forward is for us to keep trying to build those conversations and to work together to dismantle that system of inequality. So just follow the week before we had this this headline in the BBC. The Royal Society published its list of outstanding scientists elected as fellows and foreign members of the Royal Society. And then in what I think will probably be noted as academic social media faux pas of the year, Cambridge University put out this tweet. You can see where girls get the preconception from, can't you? And this list, which is the greatest greatest scientists according to the Royal Society of the year, was only less than 24% female, but also nine from Cambridge, 6 from Oxford, quite a lot from London, Edinburgh, only 2 in the Midlands, and then for the whole of the north of England, only 1. Only 1 scientist considered worthy of Royal Society fellowship from the whole of the north of England. So whilst that tweet was kind of like the archetype bad kind of stereotype, really, is this what science looks like today? We still have other aspects of sort of these sort of silos of where excellence is considered to exist. And I found a really interesting paper, it's the key plots on the left there, where research from prestigious institutions, this is from the US, but the same logic applies for the UK, spreads more quickly and more completely than work of a similar quality originating from less prestigious institutions. So essentially, ideas how good the idea is sort of in the colour code. So if your university is very prestigious, then even bad ideas from that university will spread really, really quickly, simply because of the status of that university. And people who've been to their first undergrad degree at that university are more likely to be able to stay within that sector, who are considered higher prestige in terms of where they move to. So our ideas send to how quickly we can propagate our ideas depends where those ideas started from, and it depends therefore who's in those places and how diverse the representation of people is in elite institutions. Has a massive impact on the dissemination of knowledge more widely. So who do you cite when you're looking for you're doing your referencing? If you're saying, oh, well, I need a good example of this particular method, look widely, look for the good ideas. Try not to be biased by thinking, oh, this has come from this institution or this person, it must be good. Champion good work that comes from unexpected places. Also, again, this is a preprint. I look forward to seeing the full article in due course. But there's also work being done that looks, and this was specifically in neurology. If you look at the diversity of people who work in neuroscience, then it tends to be white people tend to cite white authors more than they do cite authors of colour, if you take into account how well represented those groups are within the scientific community. And again, to me, this hints at we tend to have networks of people who are like us, predominantly like us, and so we tend to draw information from those professional networks. And so we have quite a homogenous professional network, quite a lot of us. And that feeds into, oh, have you heard of that paper? Have you seen this result? All the rest of it. Where are you looking beyond that network of the research that you're personally aware of? Also, in terms of producing work, particularly in public health, in patient-facing work, I found this is massively important. Really helpful turn of phrase that someone presented me with in discussion about this as actually a patient said, there should be nothing about us without us. If you're designing a system for our benefit, we should be having input into how that system's designed. And I'd really commend Bella Starling, who's co-director of public programs at Manchester Foundation Trust, for work in this field, and in particular our Health Our Future project, which engaged 12 to 17-year-olds from areas of Manchester who wouldn't normally get to input into the design of health services to provide that input in Oldham. So just going back full circle to the kind of things that I end up doing, the sort of seed for this lecture began with an interview I did with Elizabeth some time ago, talking about my personal approach to public engagement and science communication, that if you're working as a scientist, then there needs to be this playful, creative edge. And I think actually, as we engage with people using art, using play, using projects that everyone can get hands-on with, it's a really powerful tool. So just some photos to illustrate the kind of things that I've been doing. We run stands at Blue Dot, which again is quite a narrow socioeconomic audience, I'm aware. Certainly Lancashire Science Festival is a lot more of a mixed audience in that respect. And just kind of chatting to people where they are, and chatting to families in particular, so that those parents have met a scientist who's comfortable and happy doing what she does, and can role model that that's a possibility, hopefully, for this little girl as well. Whether it's presenting in public lectures, chatting about science in a pub. I'm open to offers if anyone wants to book me. So essentially the take home from this slide. So thank you very, very much for listening. Hopefully that's given us some food for thought and some questions in the chat. And if we don't get a chance to get back to your questions today, then please do come and find me on Twitter. I'm there probably more often than I should be. Thank you. Bye.